Some people are forgotten even while they are still standing in front of others, and the silence of that kind of forgetting is louder than any crowd. It was just after sunset in Boston when Emma Collins placed the small birthday cake on a worn wooden table inside a quiet corner of a small diner. The kind of place where the lights always felt slightly too warm and the booths carried the memory of conversations that never really mattered to anyone except the people who had them. She was 25 years old, a white American woman working as a waitress in long shifts that began before sunrise and ended after most people had already gone home. And tonight she had told herself something simple, something she had repeated in her mind all day while wiping counters and serving strangers who never looked at her long enough to remember her face. She had told herself that this year would be different, that someone would show up, even if it was only one person, even if it was only for a few minutes, even if it was late. The cake sat in front of her like a question she did not know how to answer. Its candles unlit, its frosting untouched, its presence too loud in the silence of an empty booth. She kept checking the door every few seconds, not in panic, but in a quiet hope that still refused to fully disappear even after years of being tested. Outside, Boston moved like it always did. Cars passing under streetlights, people walking in groups that felt complete without her. The city continuing its rhythm without interruption or awareness of the small stillness inside the diner. Emma had not told anyone it was her birthday that day. Not because she wanted to keep it secret, but because experience had taught her that announcing something and having it ignored often felt worse than not saying anything at all. Still, she had baked or bought the cake anyway, or at least arranged for it to be there, as if marking the moment alone would be enough to give it meaning. She stared at it now, hands resting in her lap, her posture straight but her expression slowly losing its earlier composure as time continued to pass without change. In another part of the city, far from the warm light of the diner, Dominic Russo observed the same rhythm of movement that he always observed, but tonight something interrupted the usual pattern of distance and calculation. He was a white Italian-American mafia boss, a man accustomed to reading situations in terms of control and structure. Yet what he noticed was not power or threat or strategy, but absence. Emma Collins was not part of his world, not in any direct way, but she appeared in a location that had no significance, doing something that should have held significance, and being ignored in a way that created a silence even he could recognize without needing explanation. He did not move immediately. He simply watched from a distance, as if confirming that what he was seeing was real. Back inside the diner, Emma finally stopped checking the door. The realization did not arrive as drama, but as quiet acceptance, the kind that settles in after hope has been held for too long without return. She looked at the cake again, and for a moment her expression softened into something that was not quite sadness yet, but something close to it, something shaped by repetition and expectation meeting reality one more time. The candles remained unlit. The seat across from her remained empty, and the world outside continued moving as if nothing in this small corner of Boston had changed at all, except for the fact that someone somewhere had finally begun to notice that silence like this was never truly invisible. I did not understand at first how silence could expand into something that felt physically present, but by the time Emma Collins sat alone in that small Boston diner with a birthday cake that no one else had come to acknowledge, the silence around her had already begun to take on a weight that felt heavier than sound itself. The door had not opened in several minutes, the chairs around her remained empty, and the faint background noise of the diner staff moving behind the counter felt distant, as if belonging to a different world that did not include her in any meaningful way. She was still 25 years old, a white American woman working long shifts as a waitress, and yet in that moment she felt something quietly shift inside her understanding of time, not dramatically, but in the slow realization that waiting itself could become a form of presence even when nothing arrived to meet it. The cake in front of her remained untouched, its candles still unlit, its surface too carefully prepared for an audience that never came, and she found herself staring at it not with anger or confusion, but with a kind of stillness that came after repeated expectation had finally exhausted itself. In another part of Boston, Dominic Russo continued to observe without entering the space directly, his attention fixed not on the surface details of the diner but on the absence of movement within it, because absence in his experience was never neutral. It always meant something had failed to complete its expected pattern. He was a white Italian-American mafia boss, a man accustomed to reading environments through structure rather than emotion. Yet what he was seeing now did not fit into any structure he normally used. Emma Collins was not part of his world, yet she existed in a moment that felt too defined to be accidental, a moment where celebration had been prepared but not received, where intention had been created but not answered. He did not intervene, but he also did not look away. Back inside the diner, Emma finally placed her hands lightly on the edge of the table, not to push anything away, but to steady herself in a way that felt almost unconscious. She looked at the empty seat across from her again, and this time the absence felt less like waiting and more like confirmation of something she had already begun to suspect throughout the day but had not allowed herself to fully acknowledge. The world outside continued to move at its normal pace, headlights passing through the windows, distant conversations rising and fading, life continuing in its usual rhythm without any awareness of what was happening in this small enclosed space. Yet for Emma, something had changed in how that rhythm reached her, as if distance itself had become more noticeable than presence. Dominic's attention sharpened slightly, not in urgency but in recognition of a shift that was subtle yet important because moments like this did not repeat in exactly the same way. He observed how she did not cry immediately, how she did not react in a dramatic form, but instead remained seated in a quiet stillness that suggested internal processing rather than outward expression. That detail mattered more than any visible breakdown would have, because it indicated that the moment was being absorbed rather than released. Emma finally exhaled slowly, her gaze lowering toward the cake once more, and in that small motion there was no performance, only a private acceptance forming quietly inside her perception of the evening. The candles remained unlit, the chair remained empty, and yet something about the moment no longer felt entirely like anticipation. It felt like closure without announcement, a kind of ending that did not require witnesses to exist. And somewhere beyond the diner, Dominic Russo remained still in his observation, aware now that what he had witnessed was not just absence, but a pattern of emotional isolation that had reached a point where it could no longer remain unseen. I did not realize that silence could begin to evolve into structure until the third stage of this unfolding evening, when Emma Collins remained seated alone in the small Boston diner long after she had stopped expecting anyone to arrive, and the world outside continued moving as if her absence of company meant nothing at all. The birthday cake still sat in front of her, unchanged, its surface reflecting the warm interior lighting of the diner in a way that made it feel almost too intentional. For something so emotionally empty, and yet there was no one left to interpret it except her. She was 25 years old, a white American woman working long shifts as a waitress, and what had started as a simple expectation of a shared moment had now shifted into something quieter, not fully sadness yet not neutral either, but a suspended state where time no longer felt structured by anticipation. She did not cry again, not immediately, because something in her had already moved past the first emotional impact, and entered a slower internal process of understanding that absence can remain, even after expectation has already collapsed. Across the city, Dominic Russo continued to observe from a controlled distance, not physically present in the diner, but positioned in a way that allowed him to study the environment without becoming part of it. He was a white Italian-American mafia boss, a man accustomed to reading human behavior through systems of power, timing, and consequence, yet what he was witnessing now did not align with any of those familiar categories. Emma Collins was not part of any operational structure he controlled, and yet her situation created a pattern that drew his attention with increasing consistency, because repeated emotional absence within a stable environment was not random in his experience. Inside the diner, Emma finally shifted her posture slightly, leaning back against the booth as if trying to create physical distance from the table without leaving it entirely. The chair opposite her remained empty, and she no longer looked at it with expectation, but with something closer to quiet acknowledgement, as if the possibility of it being filled had already completed its cycle and ended without resolution. The staff moved behind the counter, exchanging brief words and continuing their routines, but none of them approached her table, and this lack of interruption created a kind of isolation that felt more structured than accidental. Dominic noted this subtle transition, because emotional states that stabilize rather than break are often more significant than those that collapse quickly. Emma glanced once more at the cake, not searching for meaning now, but observing it as a completed statement rather than an unfinished question. The candles remained unlit, not because they had been forgotten, but because the moment they were meant to represent had already passed without being shared. She slowly placed her hands in her lap again, Her fingers relaxed, her breathing steady, and her expression no longer carried expectation or confusion, only a quiet internal acceptance that did not require articulation. Outside, Boston continued its usual rhythm, headlights passing through wet streets, pedestrians moving beneath streetlights, life proceeding without interruption or awareness of the small contained silence inside the diner. Dominic remained still in observation, recognizing that what he was seeing was no longer simply loneliness and isolation, but a sustained condition of absence that had reached equilibrium. Emma did not leave yet, not because she was waiting anymore, but because there was nothing immediate pulling her forward. The moment had stopped being about arrival and had become about duration, and in that shift something important changed in how it existed. It was no longer an event waiting to be resolved. It was a state that had already been fully realized. I did not understand at first how a single moment could begin to change the way a person experiences the entire structure of their surroundings, but by the time Emma Collins entered the fourth stage of that evening in the small Boston diner, something inside her perception had already begun to reorganize itself in ways that were not visible on the surface. She remained seated in the same booth, the birthday cake still in front of her, untouched and unchanged, its presence now less like an expectation and more like a quiet record of something that had already completed its meaning. The warm interior lighting of the diner continued to cast soft reflections across the table, and the sounds of distant kitchen movement and low conversation from other tables filled the space in a way that normally would have felt normal, but now carried a slightly different weight, as if even background noise had begun to feel structured rather than random. Emma did not move for a long time, not because she was waiting anymore, but because she was no longer sure what movement would represent in a moment that had already passed its emotional peak. She was 25 years old, a white American woman working as a waitress in Boston, and what had once been a simple personal expectation had now become a quiet internal realization that some absences do not resolve, they simply remain in place until they are no longer questioned. Across the city, Dominic Russo continued to observe without entering the space, maintaining a controlled distance that allowed him to study the situation without altering it, because alteration would have destroyed the clarity of what he was witnessing. He was a white Italian-American mafia boss, a man accustomed to interpreting human behavior through systems of control and consequence, yet what he saw now did not fit into any structure he normally used. Emma Collins was not connected to his world in any direct sense, but her situation created a pattern of emotional isolation that repeated in a way that drew his attention beyond simple curiosity. Inside the diner, Emma finally shifted slightly, adjusting her posture as she leaned back against the booth, her hands resting quietly in her lap. She no longer looked at the door, and she no longer checked for arrival, because the cycle of expectation had already ended within her, even if the external moment had not changed. The chair opposite her remained empty, unchanged in position, and its emptiness no longer felt like anticipation but like confirmation of something final and unspoken. The cake remained untouched, its candles still unlit, and in that stillness it no longer functioned as a symbol of celebration, but as a marker of a moment that had completed itself without participation. Dominic observed this subtle transition carefully, recognizing that emotional states which stabilize into acceptance often indicate a deeper structural shift than visible reactions. Emma glanced at the cake once more, not with disappointment or hope, but with a quiet recognition that it no longer required interpretation. It simply existed as it was, unchanged by intention. Outside, Boston continued its usual rhythm, unaffected by the silence contained within the diner, headlights passing through wet streets, people moving through sidewalks, life continuing in its standard pattern without awareness of the stillness inside one small corner of the city. Dominic remained still in observation, noting that Emma was no longer in a state of waiting, but in a state of completion without resolution, a condition where emotional expectation no longer drives perception. Emma finally exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing slightly as she remained seated, not because she was holding on to anything but because there was nothing left to hold. The moment had passed without interruption, yet its effect had not disappeared. It had simply settled into a quieter form that no longer required response. And in that quiet, both the observer and the one being observed reached the same understanding from different distances, that some moments do not end when they are over, they end when no one is left expecting them to continue. I did not realize that silence could begin to evolve beyond emotional absence and into something closer to awareness itself, but by the time Emma Collins reached the fifth stage of that evening, the experience inside the small Boston diner had already shifted from a simple moment of being alone into a sustained state of internal recalibration. She remained seated in the same booth, the birthday cake still positioned in front of her like a quiet artifact of an event that had already failed to complete itself, and yet she no longer looked at it with expectation or disappointment. Instead, she observed it with a kind of distance that did not feel cold, but steady, as if her mind had moved one layer above immediate emotional response. She was 25 years old, a white American woman working as a waitress in Boston, and what had begun as a simple hope for company had now transformed into a quiet realization that absence does not always arrive as a single moment, but can extend itself across time until it becomes its own condition of existence. Across the city, Dominic Russo continued his observation without interruption, maintaining his position outside the immediate environment, while focusing on the internal structure of what he was witnessing. He was a white Italian-American mafia boss, a man trained to read patterns in behavior and consequence, yet what he was observing now was not a matter of control or intervention, but something more subtle, a progression of emotional states that did not follow predictable escalation. Emma Collins did not belong to his world, yet her situation had become increasingly distinct in its repetition of emotional isolation, and repetition in his experience always indicated structure rather than randomness. Inside the diner, Emma finally adjusted her posture again, not as a reaction to anything external, but as a natural response to a long period of stillness. The chair opposite her remained empty, unchanged, and its emptiness no longer registered as anticipation or loss, but as a fixed point that defined the shape of the moment around it. The staff continued their work behind the counter, moving between tasks, exchanging brief words, cleaning surfaces, preparing orders, and yet none of that activity reached her in a meaningful way anymore. As if she had entered a slightly separate layer of perception where external motion no longer translated into emotional relevance. Dominic noted this carefully, because when external stimuli no longer produce internal fluctuation, the subject is no longer reacting but transitioning into a stabilized state of awareness. Emma glanced down at the cake again, but only briefly, and in that brief glance there was no longer any search for meaning or confirmation. It was simply acknowledged as part of the environment, no longer carrying the emotional weight it had earlier in the evening. The candles remained unlit, the frosting remained untouched, and the table remained exactly as it had been, yet her relationship to it had changed completely. Outside, Boston continued its ordinary rhythm, headlights moving through intersections, pedestrians passing through sidewalks, distant conversations blending into the background noise of the city, none of it altered by the quiet stillness contained within a single corner of a diner. Dominic remained still in observation, recognizing that what he was seeing was no longer a moment of emotional reaction, but a sustained phase of internal acceptance forming without external resolution. Emma exhaled slowly again, her shoulders lowering slightly as she remained seated, not because she was waiting, but because there was no longer anything that required her to move in response. The emotional cycle that had begun with expectation and moved through absence had now settled into a quieter configuration, one that did not demand closure or continuation. And in that configuration, both the observer and the observed occupied the same understanding from different positions, that some experiences do not resolve through change, but through the gradual disappearance of the need for change itself. I did not realize that a moment could continue unfolding even after it had already completed itself, but by the time Emma Collins entered the sixth stage of that evening in the small Boston diner, the experience had begun to shift from internal acceptance into something closer to quiet detachment, where emotion no longer disappeared but instead settled into the background like a stable condition rather than an active response. She remained seated in the same booth, the birthday cake still in front of her, unchanged in its physical form, yet entirely different in meaning from when she had first placed it there. She no longer looked at the door, and she no longer checked for arrival, because the idea of arrival itself had already dissolved into something irrelevant to the current moment. She was 25 years old, a white American woman working as a waitress in Boston, and what had begun as a simple expectation of shared time had now become a full realization that certain absences do not resolve through time, but instead become part of how time is experienced. Across the city, Dominic Russo continued to observe without interruption, maintaining his position outside the immediate environment while focusing on the continuity of what he had been tracking since the beginning of the evening. He was a white Italian-American mafia boss, a man trained to recognize patterns in human behavior through structure and repetition, yet what he was observing now had moved beyond simple repetition into something more stable, a sustained emotional state that no longer fluctuated in response to external stimuli. Emma Collins remained within a contained environment of silence, yet that silence was no longer active or heavy in the way it had been earlier. It had become consistent, almost neutral, like background conditions that no longer required attention to be acknowledged. Inside the diner, she finally shifted slightly again, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her posture relaxed in a way that did not indicate relief or sadness, but rather a lack of internal resistance to the present moment. The chair opposite her remained empty, unchanged, but its emptiness no longer defined the emotional structure of the scene. Instead, it simply existed as part of the physical arrangement of the space, no longer carrying interpretive weight. The staff continued their work behind the counter, moving through their tasks with routine efficiency, and yet even their presence felt increasingly distant from her internal experience, as if she were no longer fully synchronized with the same emotional timeline as the rest of the room. Dominic noted this shift carefully, because sustained emotional neutrality following prolonged expectation often indicates a transition from reaction to integration, where the subject no longer processes absence as loss but as established reality. Emma looked at the cake one final time during this stage, not with longing or resignation, but with a quiet acknowledgement that it had completed its role within the moment. The candles remained unlit, the frosting unchanged, and yet nothing about it felt unfinished anymore. Outside, Boston continued its movement without interruption, headlights passing through intersections, distant voices blending into the city's continuous rhythm, and nothing within that rhythm reflected the stillness contained inside the diner. Dominic remained still in observation, recognizing that what he was witnessing had now stabilized into a complete emotional configuration, no longer evolving in intensity but existing as a settled condition. Emma exhaled slowly, her breathing even and unforced, and in that simple physical act there was no longer transition or expectation attached to it. The moment had fully completed its internal cycle, moving from anticipation to absence, from absence to acceptance, and finally into stillness that no longer required interpretation. And within that stillness, both the observer and the observed remained connected only through the continuity of what had already been seen, not as an event still unfolding, but as a reality that had already taken its final form. I did not realize that silence could continue to deepen without changing its form, but by the time Emma Collins entered the 7th stage of that evening in the small Boston diner, something fundamental had shifted again, not in the environment around her, but in the way she existed within it. She remained seated in the same booth, the birthday cake still in front of her, unchanged physically, yet no longer functioning as an emotional reference point in the way it had earlier. The absence of other people had stopped feeling like an event and had become part of the structure of the space itself, like lighting or temperature, something present but no longer interpreted. She was 25 years old, a white American woman working as a waitress in Boston, and what had begun as a simple expectation of shared celebration had now completed a full transformation into a quiet understanding that some moments do not resolve because they were never designed to be resolved through participation. Across the city, Dominic Russo continued to observe without interruption, maintaining his position outside the immediate setting while focusing on the continuity of Emma Collins' internal state. He was a white Italian-American mafia boss, a man who had spent his life reading people through patterns of control, risk, and reaction, yet what he was witnessing now no longer fit into any category of reactive behavior. Emma Collins was no longer responding to absence as disruption. She was existing within it, as if it had become part of her baseline perception. Inside the diner, she shifted slightly in her seat, not because of discomfort or emotion, but as a natural physical adjustment within a body that was no longer under emotional fluctuation. The chair opposite her remained empty, but its emptiness no longer registered as symbolic or meaningful. It simply existed as part of the spatial arrangement, no different from the table's surface or the light above her. The staff behind the counter continued their work, but their movements felt increasingly distant from her awareness, as if she were no longer fully participating in the same layer of attention as everyone else in the room. Dominic noted this carefully, Because when external stimuli no longer produce measurable internal variation, the subject is no longer in transition but in stabilization. Emma glanced once more at the cake, but the glance carried no emotional charge, no expectation, and no disappointment. It was simply visual acknowledgement without interpretation. The candles remained unlit, the frosting remained intact, and yet the object no longer held narrative weight within her perception. Outside, Boston continued its usual motion, cars passing through intersections, pedestrians moving under streetlights, the city functioning in its continuous rhythm without interruption or awareness of the stillness contained within the diner. Dominic remained still in observation, recognizing that what he was witnessing had moved beyond emotional adaptation into a fully stabilized psychological condition, where absence, expectation, and memory no longer competed for dominance, but had settled into equilibrium. Emma exhaled slowly, her breathing steady and unforced, and in that act there was no longer transition or emotional implication attached to it, only continuation. The moment had fully detached from the need for interpretation, and what remained was not resolution or change, but a sustained state of being that no longer required acknowledgement to exist. And in that sustained state, both the observer and the observed occupied the same completed structure from different positions, where nothing more needed to happen for the moment to be fully what it had already become. I did not realize that silence could reach a point where it no longer felt like absence, but instead became a completed structure of experience, and by the time Emma Collins entered the 8th stage of that evening inside the small Boston diner, everything around her had already settled into a form that no longer required emotional interpretation. She remained seated in the same booth, the birthday cake still in front of her, unchanged in physical detail, yet now entirely neutral in meaning, as if it had completed its purpose and no longer needed to participate in her awareness. She was 25 years old, a white American woman working as a waitress in Boston, and what had begun as a simple expectation of shared presence had now fully transitioned into a state where expectation itself no longer existed as an active force. Across the city, Dominic Russo continued his observation without interruption, maintaining a controlled distance that allowed him to witness without interference, because interference was no longer relevant to what he was analyzing. He was a white Italian-American mafia boss, a man trained to recognize patterns in human behavior, yet what he was observing now was no longer a pattern in development, but a pattern that had already completed its formation and stabilized into equilibrium. Emma Collins no longer displayed emotional fluctuation in response to external conditions. Instead, she existed within a steady internal state where absence, presence, and environment no longer competed for attention. Inside the diner, she shifted her hands slightly on the table, a small movement that carried no emotional signal, only physical presence within stillness. The chair opposite her remained empty, but its emptiness no longer functioned as contrast or meaning. It simply existed as part of the spatial arrangement of the moment, indistinguishable in emotional value from any other object in the room. The staff continued moving behind the counter, voices low and routine, but even that background activity no longer registered as separate from her perception. It had become part of a continuous field of experience that no longer required differentiation. Dominic noted this final stabilization carefully, because in his understanding, when external stimuli no longer produce any measurable internal response, the subject is no longer in transition but has reached completion of emotional integration. Emma glanced at the cake one final time, not with thought or feeling, but with neutral recognition, as if confirming its physical presence without attaching meaning to it. The candles remained unlit, the frosting unchanged, and the object no longer represented anything beyond itself. Outside, Boston continued its uninterrupted rhythm, cars moving through intersections, pedestrians passing under streetlights, the city operating without awareness of the stillness contained within the diner. Dominic remained still in observation, recognizing that what he had followed since the beginning had now reached its final structural state, where no further emotional escalation or resolution would occur because the system had already closed itself internally. Emma exhaled slowly, her breathing steady and unremarkable, and in that simple continuity there was no longer transformation, only persistence. The moment had completed every stage it was capable of producing, moving from expectation to absence, from absence to acceptance, and from acceptance into stable neutrality where no further change was required. And in that final condition, Both the observer and the observed remained connected only through the fact that nothing more needed to happen for the experience to be fully complete. I did not realize that silence could reach a point where it no longer represented absence but instead became a fully completed structure of existence. And by the time Emma Collins entered the 9th stage of that evening inside the small Boston diner, nothing around her had changed physically, yet everything had already settled into its final internal form. She remained seated in the same booth, the birthday cake still in front of her, unchanged in appearance, no longer carrying emotional weight or symbolic meaning, as if the entire purpose of the moment had already been fully processed by time itself. She was 25 years old, a white American woman working as a waitress in Boston, and what had begun as a simple expectation of shared presence had now fully dissolved into a state where expectation no longer existed as a functional concept. Across the city, Dominic Russo continued his observation without movement or interruption, maintaining a controlled distance that allowed him to witness the full completion of the emotional sequence he had been tracking from the beginning. He was a white Italian-American mafia boss, a man trained to interpret human behavior through structure, repetition, and consequence, yet what he was observing now was no longer a developing pattern but a completed system that had fully stabilized into equilibrium. Emma Collins no longer responded to absence, presence, or environment in any distinguishable emotional way. Instead, she existed within a steady internal condition where external stimuli no longer produced variation in perception. Inside the diner, she remained still for several seconds, her hands resting naturally on the table, her posture calm and unchanged, not because she was holding herself together, but because there was nothing left internally that required adjustment. The chair opposite her remained empty, but its emptiness no longer carried meaning, contrast, or emotional reference. It existed only as part of the physical arrangement of the space, no different in significance from the table's surface, the lighting above, or the quiet background movement of the room. The staff continued their routine tasks behind the counter, voices low and consistent, but even that activity no longer registered as separate from her awareness. It had become part of a continuous environment that no longer required interpretation or attention. Dominic noted this final state without emotional framing, because framing was no longer necessary. What he was witnessing was not an emotional reaction, nor even a process of adaptation, but the conclusion of a full internal cycle in which the subject had reached a point of complete stabilization. Emma glanced at the cake one final time, not as an act of reflection, but as a neutral acknowledgement of its physical presence, without expectation of meaning or outcome. The candles remained unlit, the frosting unchanged, and the object no longer represented anything beyond its own existence within the space. Outside, Boston continued its normal rhythm without interruption, headlights passing through intersections, pedestrians moving beneath streetlights, the city functioning in continuous motion that remained entirely unaware of the stillness contained within the diner. Dominic remained still in observation, recognizing that there was nothing further to analyze in terms of progression, because progression itself had already completed its final stage. Emma exhaled slowly, her breathing steady and natural, and in that breath there was no longer transition, tension, or resolution, only continuity. The experience that had begun with expectation, moved through absence, and stabilized into acceptance had now reached its final condition, where nothing remained unresolved because nothing remained active. And in that final quiet state, both the observer and the observed existed within the same completed structure, where the moment no longer needed to continue in order to be fully complete.